Hi, my name is James, and in this series I'm covering my conversion to Catholicism. Because I assume there's probably 1,000 conversion videos on YouTube, I'm not going to do a long biographical walkthrough of my process. Instead, I thought it would be more useful to do a series of relatively short videos covering topics where I think I have something to say. So in this first video, I'm going to talk about the limits of Protestant thought. Because that's the reason I started investigating Catholicism in the first place. My second video is going to cover how I processed the Catholic view of salvation, because that was a major hurdle for me personally, and I imagine is for a lot of other people as well. In the third video, I'll talk about another hurdle, which is how I processed the Catholic abuse scandals and really problems with their hierarchy overall. And then lastly, in the fourth video, I'll talk about the lenses or frameworks with which Catholics and Protestants view the world. And I think this last video will be particularly interesting, so if you're only going to watch one, that's the one I would recommend. Now, you probably don't know me, so let me quickly give you some background info as to why I'm maybe worth listening to. So my value proposition is not that I am an expert on Catholicism, but rather that I know Protestantism really well. So I grew up Baptist until I was 15 or so, and then became charismatic until my early 30s. Then I went to seminary and got a master's in theology with honors and became Presbyterian, and then lastly I was Anglican. And then lastly, really, one exclaimer before I start, because I'm talking about limits in Protestant thought in a kind of a broad way. I want to emphasize that I'm not slamming individuals personally. I have no desire to knock, people that are seeking to do their best to serve Christ. So instead, I want this to be viewed in the spirit of maybe raising awareness as opposed to a critical spirit. So that being said, I'll begin by saying that evangelicalism has been in decline most of my life. So the Christian heroes I looked up to have frequently fallen or just proven to be foolish, frankly. So my main spiritual influence in my 20s was recently exposed as an adulterer. So he had women on the side his entire 45-year ministry. My pastor in seminary shot himself. The reason I went to seminary in the first place was that the Catholic ministries, the charismatic ministries I was following kept imploding, and I was hoping to introduce some more stability to that movement. So popular figures have sold out, so you can see Megan Basham's Shepherds for Sale for details about that, or just kind of proven to be ignorant people. A lot of the books that were popular 10, 20 years ago, you look back on, it's like, oh gosh, that's terrible. We just didn't know any better back then. But a lot of times this ignorance isn't their fault. So the level of a given church or a given pastor is really a combination of the strength of thought, depth of thought in his tradition, and then societal education. But when a church doesn't have intellectual traditions or strong intellectual traditions and societal education is poor, the result is necessarily ignorant pastors. So where do you go when your pastor doesn't really know what he's talking about in these confusing times? Well, you go somewhere else. But let me cover maybe 3 areas of weakness that I see in Protestant thought. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the limits of Bible study and preaching. Secondly, lack of historic development. And lastly, lack of leadership training. Most of the Protestant churches I attended over the last 15 years prided themselves on their expository preaching. If you don't know what that means, instead of the pastor preaching about hot-button topics, he'll instead preach through sections of Scripture. So he might choose an Old Testament book and then preach through a New Testament book and maybe sprinkle in the occasional topical sermon. At first I was enamored with this approach, but once you live with it for a while, the limitations become obvious. So firstly, at the end of the day, a pastor is only going to say what he believes. If a pastor isn't comfortable with the content of a passage, he isn't going to dwell on it. He might just speed through it or skip over it entirely. To give you an extreme example, I had one pastor that really only wanted to say around 10 things in his sermons, and he was going to preach on one or more of those 10 things, regardless of what the passage said. So this became kind of awkward when he was doing long historic books. Another issue is that the material chosen to preach on and the speed with which it's gone through has a really shaping effect on the congregations. There's something like 30,000 verses in Scripture. So by what is ignored and what is focused on molds the thought of the congregation. Now let me leave expository preaching and go to more like topical or systematic theology. Let's imagine how John MacArthur or John Piper would preach on a Catholic dogma. So how about, the need to save yourself, for example? Let me read you a few verses, and then I'll think about how John Piper or someone like that might preach on those. Jude chapter 1, verses 22 through 23. And have mercy on those who doubt. Save others by snatching them out of the fire. To others show mercy with fear, hating even the garment stained by the flesh. James chapter 5, 19 through 20. My brothers, if anyone among you wanders from the truth, and someone brings him back, let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death, and will cover over a multitude of sins. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 16. Keep a close watch on yourself and on the teaching. Persist in this, for by doing so, you will save both yourself and the hearers. Now I could have chosen other verses, but these convey the idea clearly enough. An eloquent pastor might spend a week on each verse. So let's say do a 2-month series on the need to save yourself and your family. Or he might kind of rush through it in 2 weeks or so. But the punchline here is, of course, he's not going to do this. Why? Because it's not in the Bible? No, I just read you the verses. He's not going to do it because he doesn't believe those verses. I saw the same issue with the Protestant teaching on salvation. An incredible amount of New Testament material is simply skipped over because pastors can't and don't want to deal with it. I would consider myself a Bible guy. I've spent most of my adult life trying to study it deeply. But I was shocked by the amount of material that I was able to overlook, I would say maybe even subconsciously, in my effort to be a good Reformed Christian. So I'll talk more about that in the next video. Now to the limits of Protestant thought. When I attended seminary in my early 30s, I learned who the best Protestant thinkers were. And one thing I noticed was that the more sound their thinking or teaching was, the more likely they were to reference Catholic teaching. Now at this point I was kind of charismatic Baptist, and so this was shocking to me. I grew up thinking that Catholics didn't read the Bible, and they basically invented their own religion. But history actually tells a different story. Digging into the history, I learned that there was actually a narrow window for kind of high Protestant development. The Reformation was soon followed by the Enlightenment. If you don't know what the Enlightenment is, it's basically the rejection of the church's synthesis on faith and reason with a kind of secular hyper-rationality. So Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517, and by 1700 the Enlightenment had taken over. So Protestantism had less than 200 years to develop their kind of worldview or scope of thought or whatever you want to call that. So contrast that with the Catholic Church that held out until, let's say, the 20th century. So it had nearly 2,000 years of intellectual development, so basically 10 times as long. So since the Enlightenment, the quality of Protestant thought has a near 1-to-1 correlation with the health of society. And because society is extremely unhealthy right now, Protestant thought is too. Besides lack of solid Protestant theology, another issue is poor leadership training. So for those that aren't aware of how seminary works, let me lay out how future pastors are trained. Well, actually, before that, let me go ahead and say that obviously many Protestant churches don't require their pastors to have any training at all. They just need some basic agreement and the ability to hold a crowd. But let's assume a higher bar for the purposes of this video. So an MDiv program is going to be something like 100 credit hours. 16 or so of that will be Greek and Hebrew classes, and then you have lots of, hopefully, preaching classes, education classes, counseling classes, history classes. Once you subtract off all those credit hours, you aren't actually left with much time for solid mental and spiritual formation. And then add to this that students these days mostly arrive unprepared for the work, and so they have to be brought up to speed before seminary can truly begin. I had a professor tell the class that we could expect to get to the level of a well-catechized high school student from 100 years ago, which was fairly discouraging. So contrast that with my Catholic priest who went to seminary for 7 years. And note that's longer than many Protestant scholars go to school. So maybe 3 years for their MDiv and then go to Cambridge and do 3 years for their PhD. So people have taken offense when I've spoken about the low standard of Protestant thought. As I said before, I don't want to denigrate anybody who's trying to serve Christ to their best, but maybe the best way to illustrate this is think about what Isaac Newton said, that he could see farther because he was standing on the shoulders of giants. Now think back to the historic development section. So Protestants had around 200 years to develop their thinking. Catholics had 2,000. So in those 2,000 years, the Catholic Church has a lot of giants for people to stand on the shoulders of, and Protestants, in contrast, don't. And in fact, I would argue that many of their leaders are leading people astray. For example, Luther is digging a hole, not standing on a pillar. So Catholics have the most complete intellectual framework that I'm aware of, and a grid for training their leaders in it. So this makes them far better equipped to speak about faith and morality and life in general. So for the past 5 years or so long before I considered converting to Catholicism, I basically started ignoring Protestant thinkers because the quality of their thought wasn't any better than that of the average believer. So I think that's enough for this video. In my next video, I'll continue this theme about Protestant thought to discuss how I process the Catholic view of salvation, basically through Bible study. God bless.